Whatever problems anyone may have with the capital, believe me when I say that if it released its grip on the districts for even a short time, the entire system would collapse. Hey everyone, welcome back to a novel review, the book podcast, where every week I review a different book. This week is, of course, no different. I'm reviewing Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. Hold it up for the benefit of those on YouTube. This is the second book in the Hunger Games trilogy. This is the sequel to the Hunger Games. I loved the Hunger Games. I enjoyed the Hunger Games a lot more than I thought I would when I read it. I did that episode a month ago, so go check that out first if you're interested. But we came to Catching Fire for this month. Fantastic story. Really, really loved this one, to be quite frank. I think I enjoyed it more than the Hunger Games. And the reason I think I enjoyed it a lot more than the Hunger Games is I think it's almost a perfect sequel. And it really kind of got me thinking as to, what is a perfect sequel? What is a sequel? What makes a good sequel when it comes to stories and films as well, by extension? And it kind of got me thinking about it. It's something I've not really, thought about too much for no particular reason. It's just, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. And so I kind of loosely pegged it down into my head is that there's two kinds of sequels. There's a sequel that comes out of want, not necessity, and then there's a sequel that comes out of necessity that you might also want as well. You might not want it, but generally it comes out of necessity. The necessity ones are things like Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, where it's not really a sequel, it's just kind of the next part of the same story. Tolkien himself famously didn't actually want the stories broken up because he was like, it's just one story. So you're essentially slicing up one story into digestible chapters for the consumer to then sell off more books, of course. Whereas this book, Catching Fire, as part of the Hunger Games sort of trilogy, is definitely a sequel of want, not necessarily necessity, because the Hunger Games itself is a completely contained story within itself. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has, a very much a satisfactory end, and it's the kind of story that you could read beginning to end. And if you were like, that was fun, but I'm not really enjoying it that much, you can absolutely stop at the end of Hunger Games and nothing is detracted from that particular story itself. So what then a sequel is in this instance is it's an extension on the first story. And it kind of got me thinking about what constitutes therefore a good sequel, because some people are like, this sequel sucked, this sequel was great, blah, blah, blah. And for me, it's really, I realized the organics of it. It has to be a completely organic sequel in that it actually fits into the wider arc of the story, even though you're not necessarily aware what the wider arc is when you start the sequel. But it's kind of like when you're you got a house extension or something like that, you're doing some renovations and you've got the house and it might be a nice red brick house, and then you do an extension up or to the side or to the back, and it's a completely different material used for the extension, and you can point at it and go, yep, that's obviously an extension because the rest of the house is red brick. That's not an organic extension. We can tell that from the offset. And that for me is just kind of my ridiculous way of trying to explain what I mean when I say organic, in that the sequel has to add something to the story that also doesn't detract something from the original story of the Hunger Games. It has to actually build on the story in a really natural way that I think probably makes it a bit more complicated than that might sound if you're creating a really organic story, because you've essentially got a story in the Hunger Games in the first book that is, opening, that is open, middle, and then shut, and it's complete. So how do you add something to something that's complete and also make it feel organic? And I think this book, Catching Fire, did it so well, because I too came into it, and even though I've seen the films, I'd kind of semi-forgotten what they're about, and I was like, how's it going to feel reading it? And it really does read as an organic story that I think masterfully adds and invites us back into a world, and it's a really wonderful world, because I think in the Hunger Games, we got a fair glimpse of it. We got enough of a glimpse to be interested enough to come back. It's an interesting world. I think they're interesting characters, and even though we're not supposed to enjoy the Hunger Games because it's the slaughter of children, needless slaughter of children, and a gross practice and ceremony, it is still kind of fun to read, and you do have a lot of fun reading the story, even though that is, kind of a vast duality of the story, and that we enjoy reading it, but it's actually disgusting and despicable in practice. So I think I'll stop there talking about sequels. I'll do a brief overview. As I said, This story comes about completely naturally. At the end of the Hunger Games, Katniss and Peeta have survived the Hunger Games. They are the victors. There's the first time we've had 2 victors for the Hunger Games. They had the famous act of going to eat the berries to kill themselves so that there is no winners. And the Capitol is like, no, stop, don't do that. We actually need some victors of the Hunger Games to pretty much parade you around for the pomp and ceremony of everyone else. So don't kill yourself. You both get to win. Hurrah. Now, this act is really important because for Katniss and Peeta by extension, although we have a point of view of Katniss throughout the trilogy, it is just an act of pure survival. They are trying to survive the Hunger Games no matter the cost. But the Capitol actually views it as in a completely different light. They see this as an act of defiance, and the Capitol then is incredibly worried that this act of defiance is going to spread or catch fire, as is in the title, and spread to the districts as we can or you can defy the Capitol and live. And it's a really strong sentiment that can easily spread throughout people that do feel beleaguered and oppressed by the pomp of the Capitol. As a result of this, we follow Katniss and Peeta as they go on their victory tour, and then when it's sort of alluded to that Katniss hasn't quite convinced the other districts that she is, quote unquote, very much committed to the Capitol, and she's very happy to be a victor of the Hunger Games, even though she's not. There is then a reaping, except it's the reaping for the 3rd Quarter Quell, the 75th year of the Hunger Games, and it is a masterful stroke by President Snow because the reaping is not coming from citizens of the respective districts. They're going to reap from the living victors of previous Hunger Games. So it's a re-reaping for the victors, even though the previous laws are that if you won the Hunger Games, you've got immunity for the rest of your life and you're meant to live like a celebrity. So it's an absolute masterstroke where it's guaranteed to get Katniss back in the ring and therefore in a life or death situation. It's a masterstroke by Suzanne Collins because, like I said, we actually quite enjoy the Hunger Games because as much as we hate to admit it, or as much as I hate to admit it, I do enjoy the pomp and the ceremony of it, and then of course being in the games as well because it's fun to read, even though, as I said, it's despicable. So it's a masterstroke from President Snow. It's a masterstroke from Suzanne Collins as the writer to get us in essentially the same situation, but make it feel completely natural and also be adding to the context of the story in that President Snow is trying to stifle a potential revolution on the backs of Katniss Everdeen, who has defied the Capitol. So as I said, this book definitely builds on the Hunger Games. One thing I think I really loved about the book is, I guess, the character development, but I'll speak about that in a second, but just sort of the deepening and leaping into this wonderful world that we've sort of got a pretty fair view of in the Hunger Games, but to get more of a fleshed out view in this book, I think is really, really nice and is one of those things that you quite enjoy. And one of those scenes is probably my most favorite scene of this book, is the appearance of President Snow in Katniss Everdeen's house in District 12. And it's just the two of them and they have this conversation, and it's this really wicked, wonderful conversation where President Snow is explaining to Katniss sort of the nature of the fact that she is unknowingly, unconsciously, maybe she's aware or not, but she is the face of a potential rebellion because of her act of defiance. And she, as a 16-year-old girl, I believe she still is in this, is just kind of like, dude, I was just trying to survive. And he's like, sure, I get that, but no matter what, you are now the face of a potential rebellion. You need to try convince me that you are not the face of a rebellion. You need to go out on your victory tour and play act this role that you will now serve for society. And this absolutely terrifies her, as it would terrify anyone, because he is the head of this abusive government that, deals out death and destruction to children. He's not really afraid of much. And it's this really, I think, wonderful conversation between the two of them where it's kind of going up against an absolute powerhouse versus someone that has openly, accidentally defied them. And it's this, I think, great moment for Katniss because it's kind of like the shattering of the glass where she begins to understand the game that she's in. And even though that she's survived the Hunger Games per se, she never gets to escape the Hunger Games because year on year, she is going to be paraded through the Capitol. Year on year, she is always going to be appearing in the Capitol at the time of the next year's Hunger Games. She is always going to be a victor of the Hunger Games. She is always going to be subject to the Hunger Games. She is going to be living with this situation for the rest of her life. And I think that's sort of the moment where she begins to understand that this is kind of the real game now. They're surviving the Hunger Games, which of course is terrifying, but this now is the game, the larger game that she is in, the game of life, where she needs to convince people that even though she's a survivor of the Hunger Games and is going to be absolutely suffering PTSD for the rest of her life, that it's actually a fun thing to enjoy, and we love the pomp and ceremony, and that it's wonderful, and the reapings are fine, and I'm going to go coach them for years to come, and it's wonderful, and we're not going to stir any dissent in any kind of district for the rest of our lives. And it's just that wonderfully tense conversation between them both where, yeah, Katniss seems to sort of develop and begin to understand the nature of the game, of almost political games, and sort of what that means for the context of her as a person, and what that means in the context of the wider story. And I think that masterfully balances a lot of other character development through the story. And that for me is probably, I know I just said that was probably my favorite part of the story, but I think my overarching favorite part of the story was the character development in this story. And, Gale is a fantastic example of what I mean by that, because Gale is a boy. He's 17, 18 now. He's living, and he's only lived in District 12, and he only gets his information through what he hears through stories and what he sees on the TV screen. And in the Hunger Games, in the first book, he's had to watch essentially the girl that he loves go off and fight to the death, and also sort of make out with this other boy, Peter, to survive. And within that starts to fuel this fire within him, and you can see him start to become more and more ostracized from Katniss as a person, but he also becomes more and more extreme with his views. He starts to develop these quite extremist views, and he has much a greater sense of the world being black and white, and it's kind of, that's how he views it. He views the capital as pure evil, and District 12 and the districts as pure good, and he views it in a much more black and white way. Whereas Katniss, now having lived through the Hunger Games herself, is a lot more nuanced in it, in that she's been to the capital and she's experienced it in a different way, and she understands that not everyone in the capital is bad. Not everyone in the capital is an evil person. Some of them are slaves themselves, and a lot of them have just been indoctrinated into this lifestyle. A lot of them don't understand that it's necessarily a bad thing that they reap these kids every year, because every year they're told to celebrate it in a way, and it's something that goes on in everyday life in our world as well. You just kind of permit a lot of evil things to happen because you've been raised on them and because it's convenient for whatever reason. And so there's a lot more nuance to just hating things more than just black and white, good and bad. And I think it's the development of Gale into that definitely more black and white character, and the development of Katniss into a more nuanced character, but also seeing them interact with each other and the development of their relationship as a result of that, I think is done really, really well. That adds a lot of depth and dynamic to the story. I will say, though, that I wasn't a particular fan of the way the story went with the love triangle of Gale, Peter, and Katniss. It was just something that I could sort of see coming from a mile away, and I didn't particularly love the addition of that. I don't think it's always strictly necessary, but I also know that this is youth fiction, and that for Katniss as a person, as well as anybody in that situation, would also develop feelings based on different things. So even though I didn't like it, it did feel actually quite natural, because she's kind of been thrust into this life or death situation, and she's got Peter being like, I've loved you ever since I've known you. And she's like, okay, that's kind of confusing, but I'm willing to die for you, but you're willing to die for me. So it's obviously very intensely heightened emotions there. But then Katniss is also like, I've grown up with this guy, Gale, my whole life, and it's never been a romantic friendship. But obviously we've been at ages where romance isn't the forefront of our mind. We've been 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. But suddenly when you start to get to those older ages and you start to develop as a person as you get older, you start to then wonder, oh, I do actually really enjoy this guy's company. Maybe I do like him more than just a friend, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what you want in a partner. It's someone that you can get on with really, really well, and that challenges you in different ways and pushes you to do different things. So then she starts to get confused and wonder, okay, maybe I like Peter, maybe I like Gale. And it's this, like I said, it feels like a completely organic kind of love triangle. I can see why she's confused. She herself is a 17-year-old girl, 16-year-old girl. So it is completely fair, but it's not something that I was like absolutely dying for. Also, probably because as Gale becomes more and more black and white, I can see him becoming more and more extreme, and I can see that he's not someone that I would necessarily want to be with myself. So I think that's sort of what I don't like about it, is that you can sort of see from an outside view, like, don't go for that guy. So I don't know. It obviously was, I think, always going to happen in a book like this, but it was just something that I wasn't absolutely wrapped up in. I think as a whole, the development of the world as well was really well fleshed out. You know, that was one of the big things I noticed in the first book, was that the world building was, I think, really, really nice and done really, really well. And I thought the continuous world building that's going on within the story was absolutely fantastic. You know, you get to the capital, Katniss and Peter get to the capital, and they're more or less free to party, but they don't want to party because they're suffering from PTSD, and it's kind of like this shocking duality of the situation, and that you've finally got this freedom that you've probably dreamed about your entire life. You know, the idea of being in the capital and being free to party is something you've probably always dreamed about, living in District 12. And now that they're there, they're like, oh, I don't really want to be here. I'd rather go back to my previous life. It's kind of, the grass is always greener. And I think there are just little scenes within the book that really build on this. You know, there's one particular dinner scene where they're absolutely, there's a huge feast in front of them, and they want to sort of try just one mouthful of everything, but there's still too much food. And this is obviously coming from Katniss and Peter's perspective, where in District 12 they've got a complete lack of supply of food. And so when they're, you know, presented with this absolute smorgasbord of food, they want to try every single piece, because this is a level of decadence that they've never been privy to. And so they go around and they're trying everything, and they get full, and then they're like, oh, I'm too full, I haven't tried everything. And a character comes up and they're like, oh, we'll just go vomit, you know, like I think it was it take a pill and go vomit, or just go vomit, like, you know, empty your stomach and go again. And it's kind of like this really shocking moment where you're like, oh, that's the level of decadence this capital has. That's the level of decadence this part of the society has, is that they will eat food just for the pure decadence of it. They will eat food till they're ready to burst, go vomit and eat some more, while people out in District 12, District 11, all the way back, you know, to 2, are starving to death, are struggling to put food on the table, are working 12-hour shifts just to buy a loaf of bread kind of situation. Whereas in the capital, they are partying hard. They are living an extremely decadent life where they are just abusing the lifestyle without consequences as well. And it's just kind of these really sharp moments in the story that help you understand the wider context of what this world is like. You know, there's the moments obviously where we see starving people in District 12 contrasted against these moments in the capital where they're vomiting to make to make room for more food. And then once again, we are back in the Hunger Games themselves, and it is fun. It's so different. It's, you know, Katniss is obviously up against other victors. There's a lot of egos going on. Obviously in the first one, there's a lot of kids that don't want to be there because they've just been reaped and they're placed in this situation with no formal training. But everyone now in this Hunger Games, it's kind of like the best of the best. Everyone there has won before and is obviously a killer and obviously understands. They know what it takes to win. They are prepared to do what it takes to win. And so it kind of just puts titans against themselves in this fantastic situation. And I mean, it's fascinating, again, being sort of a young adult novel. Suzanne Collins is not afraid to kill characters, and she is not afraid to kill them in a really brutal way. And I think that's what I really enjoy about this series, is it does feel like a lot of characters aren't safe. It does feel like it's going down routes that don't feel like it's going to be a happy ending, and it's not a happy ending. I mean, Mags gets an absolutely terrible death in this, you know, justice for Mags. And it's kind of like these moments where characters die, and there's just no time. There's no sentiment behind it. There's no time to stop and pause. You're in the games. You can't stop and mourn this person's death. You need to move on because someone else is coming for you. And so it's absolutely, I guess, enjoyable to be in the arena again. I think it unfolds in a different way. You know, we've got the clock this time, which tick tick is fantastic. We've obviously got, like I said, a complete smorgasbord of characters going on. We've got all the egos going on, but we've also got the brilliance of all these characters. You know, a lot of them sometimes win through the pure strength that they exude, but some of them have won through their intelligence, and it's not always the biggest, fittest, and strongest that's going to win you the games. It is sometimes the intelligence behind the characters that is going to win you the game. So it's really nice, really well balanced for that reason. And I think I'll leave it there because that's where the story kind of ends. It ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. You know, I won't say any more in case you don't know what the ending is, but it does end in this way where you are kind of left thinking, what the hell is going on? So I will say, yeah, definitely my favorite out of the two books, out of the Hunger Games and Catching Fire. Definitely built upon the Hunger Games in a really nice way. Definitely added to the story. Definitely was a great read. A real page turner. Like I said, I think Suzanne Collins has a fantastic writing style. She is just churning through the pages. You can read it at a lovely pace and it's enjoyable. And I said this in the first episode of the Hunger Games, in that every page feels exciting in some way. It always feels like it's building on something or building to something. So I really enjoy the writing style. Very, very readable. Very, very enjoyable. Just some good quality, fun books that actually have some very politically charged undertones that actually get you thinking and starting a conversation. So I would definitely recommend the series as a whole, even though I haven't finished the last book. But, you know, just how good this second book was, I've absolutely got to read the third book now. And I will be reading that for the next episode. But today, just Catching Fire. I'm going to rate this a 4.5 out of 5. So that was Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. Okay, so what was I reading? Well, lo and behold, I was reading The Hunger Games Mockingjay, the final book in the trilogy. And yeah, I'm probably halfway through. It's a very different story, and that was always going to happen, of course. It's always got to come to a head at some stage. It is progressing with a slightly different pace, I'm going to say, but it's no less enjoyable. It is shaping up to be a very different book though, and this one does feel like it is quite a bit darker. So I'm going to be bringing you this episode in December. Make sure you like and subscribe for that. But as always, thanks for listening all the way to the end, guys, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.